Over the last few months, I've been asking loads of random people who their favourite actor is. Partly just because I thought it might be useful for a future video, but mostly just because I find it really interesting. And whenever anyone asks me the same question back, my answer is always the same: Robert De Niro. So as soon as I decided I wanted to make more videos beyond just the DiCaprio ranking, I knew he had to be the subject of the next one. One thing that makes this project slightly trickier, however, is that De Niro is famously private. Unlike DiCaprio, where there were loads of interviews and stories to pull from, many of the quotes in this video come from directors, co-stars and collaborators like Martin Scorsese. Sometimes understanding De Niro's process means looking at what the people around him had to say about it. So today I'll be ranking 17 Robert De Niro performances, using the same qualification criteria as the DiCaprio video. Now, a couple of these performances are here on a bit of a technicality, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to them. So with that said, let's just get started with number 17. Coming in at the last place is The Intern. Honestly, I think this performance taught me more about how I should structure these videos in the future than it did anything about acting. The Intern only qualified for this ranking because of a nomination De Niro got at the Critics' Choice Awards for Best Actor in a Comedy. And after watching it, I've realised that future videos are going to need much stricter criteria for what actually qualifies for these rankings, because this just doesn't cut it. And that's not because De Niro is bad here, he's perfectly fine. De Niro plays Ben Whittaker, a widower struggling to find purpose after retirement. As De Niro himself described it, Ben feels like there's something missing in his life, and his new job is his attempt to fill that gap. The problem is that while Ben is a perfectly nice character, he's also a fairly ordinary one. He's kind, he's hardworking, he's supportive, he wants the people around him to succeed, but because of the nature of the story, the stakes are so low that we never really get to see De Niro in any interesting situations. The most tense sequence in the entire film involves Anne Hathaway accidentally sending a text message to her mum, and the solution is for the characters to break into her house and delete it. I remember when De Niro used to do proper heists. Anyways, I think this film proves something quite interesting. Even the greatest actors in the world still need great material. Because when you give Robert De Niro a character without much conflict, complexity or dramatic weight, the result is perfectly watchable, but not particularly memorable. I also have to say, for a film that earned him a Best Actor in a Comedy nomination, I don't think I laughed a single time. So with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Ben Whittaker in The Intern a 5.5 out of 10. And it's coming in at number 17 on the list. Coming in at number 16 is Midnight Run. And unlike The Intern, this one is actually a film I enjoyed. De Niro plays Jack Walsh, a bounty hunter tasked with bringing a fugitive across America whilst being chased by the FBI, the Mafia, and just about everybody else along the way. What makes the performance work is how effortlessly likeable Jack is. He's sarcastic, stubborn, constantly irritated by everyone around him, and yet somehow remains incredibly easy to root for. Whether he's arguing with federal agents...
These sunglasses, they're really nice. Are they government issued, or do all you guys go like to the same store to get them?
hot wiring cars, or trying to keep control of an increasingly ridiculous situation, De Niro brings a lot of charm to this role. One thing I particularly liked is that underneath all of Jack's bravado, there's actually a decent person hiding there. We learn that he lost his job as a police officer because he refused to take a payoff, and some of the film's strongest moments come when we see the tougher exterior begin to crack, particularly in the scenes involving his ex-wife and daughter. The problem is that while Jack is a very entertaining character, I don't think he's a particularly demanding one. Compared to the performances higher up on this list, there just isn't a huge amount of dramatic complexity here. He's funny, he's charismatic, and he's easy to spend 2 hours with, but I never felt like De Niro was being pushed to the same level as he would be elsewhere in his career. That doesn't make it a bad performance, far from it. It's just one that I enjoyed more than I admired, maybe. So, with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Jack Walsh in Midnight Run a 7.5 out of 10, and it's coming in at number 16 on the list. Coming in at number 15 is New York, New York. And this is the first Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese collaboration that we're going to be discussing in this video. Considering how closely these two names are linked nowadays, it feels strange that the first De Niro and Scorsese collaboration we should be talking about is going to be all the way down at number 15. But while the partnership would go on to produce some truly iconic work, this particular performance lands a little lower for me. De Niro plays Jimmy Doyle, a talented saxophone player who falls in love with aspiring singer Francine Evans, played by Liza Minnelli. And Jimmy is one of the most frustrating characters in this entire list. He's charismatic, passionate and undeniably talented, but he's also stubborn, controlling, jealous and completely incapable of getting out of his own way. Every time something good happens to him, he somehow finds a way to make it harder than it needs to be. One thing I really appreciated when watching this was just how much work De Niro was putting into making Jimmy feel authentic. For the musical sequences, De Niro didn't actually try to become a professional saxophone player. As he later explained, he knew he would never be able to play as well as the musicians whose recordings were being used for the film. So instead, he focused on learning the fingering posture and physical movements of a real saxophone player. He said the goal wasn't to master the instrument, it was to make sure that anyone watching who actually knew how to play the saxophone wouldn't immediately know he was faking it. Because as he said, movies are an illusion. And that's a very De Niro approach to acting. He wasn't chasing perfection, he was just chasing authenticity. Liza Minnelli once said that De Niro had an intensity and mystery about him, that his eyes seemed to look outwards whilst also looking inwards. And I think that's especially true here. Because beneath all of Jimmy's confidence there's a deep insecurity that slowly destroys the relationship at the centre of the film. What makes the character especially interesting isn't that he's a bad person. It's that he genuinely loves Francine, but his pride, jealousy and stubbornness constantly sabotage the very thing he cares about most. And what makes the ending hit is just how ordinary it feels. These aren't two people separated by some huge tragedy. They're just two people who met, fell in love, got married, had a child together, and then slowly drifted apart. Because sometimes that's what life is. You meet people, you love them, and then it just ends. And by the time Jimmy and Francine see each other again, all that's left is really a mutual respect for the life that they once shared. So after all that, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Jimmy Doyle in New York, New York an 8 out of 10, and it's coming in at number 15 on the list. Coming in at number 14 is Analyze This. Now on paper this probably sounds like a joke. Robert De Niro plays a New York mob boss who starts having panic attacks and ends up in therapy. But what surprised me most on rewatch is just how much this performance actually works. De Niro plays Paul Vitti, a powerful mafia boss who's terrified of appearing weak. The problem is that he's suddenly dealing with panic attacks, anxiety, and emotion that he's spent his entire life trying to suppress. And that's where the performance becomes interesting. Because Paul cares deeply about how other people see him. He refuses medication because he thinks it makes him less of a man. He hates admitting vulnerability. Even the idea of therapy feels humiliating to him. At the same time, De Niro never lets us forget that this is still a dangerous man. He can walk into a room, tell people to sit down, and they do it immediately. He still has that presence and authority that makes him feel like a believable mob boss. What makes the performance work is the contrast between those two sides. One minute, he's intimidating everyone around him, and the next he's crying in a therapist's office because he's finally confronting the trauma of watching his dad get murdered. And honestly, some of the funniest moments in the film come from De Niro's line deliveries.
It's okay. I wasn't really gonna whack it. Oh, all right. Maybe I was gonna whack it. But I was real conflicted about it.
The comedy isn't really built around jokes. It's built around watching a man who thinks he has everything under control, slowly realising that he doesn't. Now, I don't think the role gives De Niro quite enough material to compete with the performances higher up on this list, but I was surprised by how much more I enjoyed this the second time watching it. It's funny, it's surprisingly emotional at times, and most importantly, Paul Vitti feels like a real person rather than just a parody. So with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Paul Vitti and Analyze This an 8 out of 10, and it's coming in at number 14 on the list. Coming in at number 13 is The Wizard of Lies, and this is another one of our little technicalities, shall we say. Unlike the other entries on this list, The Wizard of Lies was actually a made-for-television film rather than a theatrical release. However, De Niro still reaped Best Actor nominations in a TV movie or miniseries at the Golden Globes, Critics' Choice and Screen Actors Guild Awards for this performance. So I kind of feel like it does qualify. And honestly, I'm quite glad that it qualifies because this is one of the more interesting performances on the list. De Niro plays Bernie Madoff, the financier behind one of the largest frauds in history. But what surprised me most on rewatch is that De Niro doesn't play Bernie as a traditional villain, because Bernie doesn't seem to think he's one. Even after his arrest, even after his family falls apart, even after he receives a 150-year sentence in prison. he still finds ways to explain his actions to himself. He talks about being made into a symbol. He talks about the country needing somebody to blame. And at one point he even seems offended when someone compares him to Ted Bundy, as though the two belong in completely different categories. One thing I found particularly interesting is how De Niro prepared for this role. He spent years trying to get the project made after reading Diana Henriquez's book, which the film is based on, and research Madoff extensively through books, interviews, footage, and people who knew him. And in typical De Niro commitment fashion, he even shaved his own hair rather than wear a bald cap because he thought it would feel, say it with me now, more authentic. What I respect most about the performance is that De Niro never reduces Bernie to a cartoon villain. He's manipulative, arrogant, and deeply flawed, but he's also disturbingly ordinary. And that's what makes him feel unsettling. Not the fraud itself, the fact that he never seemed to fully accept the damage he caused. The film was also smart enough to focus on the effects Bernie's actions had on his family, particularly his relationship with his wife and sons. By the end, the money almost feels secondary to the personal destruction left behind. Now, I don't think Bernie is quite as compelling a character as some of the performances higher up on this list, but De Niro gives him a quiet humanity that stops him from becoming a caricature. So with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Bernie Madoff in The Wizard of Lies an 8 out of 10. At number 12, we have Meet the Parents. And this might genuinely be one of the most underrated performances on this entire ranking. Partly because it's a comedy, and partly because I think I've seen this film so many times that I almost took it for granted. I probably watched Meet the Parents more times than any other film on this list. Definitely. Probably 5, 10 times, who knows. And every single time, the thing that makes it work is Mr. De Niro. De Niro plays Jack Byrnes, a retired CIA operative whose daughter has brought her boyfriend Greg home to meet the family. And from the second Jack appears on screen, the film tells you exactly who he is. There's a musical cue for him. Suddenly everything feels more tense, slightly more serious, like Greg has accidentally wandered into the wrong movie. What makes Jack so funny is that he treats every situation like an intelligence operation. He's constantly scanning rooms, listening to conversations he shouldn't be listening to, watching people, testing people, looking for weaknesses. If Greg says something strange, Jack notices. If Greg tells a lie, Jack spots it immediately. And if Greg makes a mistake, Jack is more than happy to point it out in front of absolutely everybody. The brilliant thing is that Jack genuinely believes he's being reasonable. From his perspective, he's simply trying to work out whether this man is good enough for his daughter. The problem is that he's so suspicious, controlling and paranoid that he creates most of the problems himself. One of the most famous scenes, the lie detector sequence, actually came from De Niro. In an interview, he talked about a friend who worked at the CIA telling him about lie detector tests. And he thought it could make a great scene. So he pitched the idea to the director, Jay Roach, and it eventually evolved into one of the funniest moments in the entire film. And it's also a perfect example of what De Niro enjoyed about comedy during this period of his career. He said that comedy gave him the freedom to make little eccentric choices that wouldn't work in a straight drama. And Jack is full of those choices. The way he stares, the way he pauses, the way he seems personally offended by completely insignificant things, the way he treats Greg not saying grace like a national security threat. It's all hilarious because Jack takes every single moment completely seriously. But what elevates the performance beyond a collection of funny scenes is that Jack actually changes. At the start of the film, he doesn't care whether Greg makes Pam happy. He only cares whether Greg meets his standards. But by the end, he finally realises that those aren't the same thing. And for a character who spends 2 hours convinced that he's always right, that's actually a pretty meaningful piece of growth. He's funny, he's intimidating, he's controlling, he's ridiculous, and somehow he's also completely believable. Honestly, every time I rewatch this film, I come away appreciating this performance more. So I'm giving Robert De Niro as Jack Byrnes in Meet the Parents an 8.5 out of 10, and it's coming in at number 12 on the list. Narrowly missing out on our top 10 here is Goodfellas. And yeah, before anyone says anything, I know this is a bit controversial. And to be clear, I completely understand why. This is also our second Scorsese and De Niro collaboration on the list. And unlike New York, New York, this is the partnership starting to fire on all cylinders. De Niro plays Jimmy Conway, a career criminal and mentor figure to Henry Hill, played by Ray Liotta. And what I find so fascinating about Jimmy is that for most of the film, he doesn't seem particularly frightening. Tommy is frightening. Tommy is unpredictable. Tommy is the guy who might smash a bottle over your head because you laughed at the wrong moment. Jimmy is different. Jimmy smiles. Jimmy jokes around. Jimmy buys drinks. Jimmy looks after people. If you met these characters in real life, Jimmy is probably the one you'd want to spend time with. And that's exactly what makes him so dangerous. Because unlike Tommy, Jimmy doesn't hurt people because he's angry. He hurts people because it's practical. There's a coldness to the character that slowly reveals itself across the film. Every problem has a solution. Every loose end can be tied up. Every inconvenience can be removed. And De Niro never pushes any of this. He doesn't play Jimmy like a movie villain. He plays him like a man going about his day, which somehow makes the character even scarier. One thing I found really interesting whilst researching this film is just how obsessed De Niro was when preparing for this role. Because Jimmy Conway was based on a real gangster called Jimmy Burke, and De Niro repeatedly contacted Henry Hill to ask incredibly specific questions about him. How did he walk? How did he hold a cigarette? How did he carry himself? What little habits did he have? Nick Pileggi, who wrote the book Wise Guy that the film is based on, said that De Niro became obsessed with details, constantly going back for more information. De Niro later said that Henry Hill was one of the most important people he could speak to because he'd spent years observing the real Jimmy Burke. And you can feel that level of preparation in the performance. Jimmy never feels like a movie gangster. He feels like somebody you could actually meet. There's even a famous story that during the Lufthansa heist scenes, De Niro insisted on using real cash because fake money didn't feel right in his hands. Which sounds completely ridiculous until you remember that that is exactly the sort of thing that De Niro loves to do. The moments that stuck with me most when watching the film weren't the violent moments. They were the quiet ones. The way Jimmy's face tightens when people start spending money after the Lufthansa robbery. The paranoia, the suspicion. The sense that he's constantly calculating. You can practically watch him deciding who lives and who dies by the end. And by the end, Jimmy barely trusts anybody. And yet, De Niro never changes the performance dramatically. The same guy who was laughing with Henry at the beginning is still there. The only difference is that now we understand what he's capable of. It's a great performance in a truly iconic film, and one that comfortably earns a place on this list. So with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Jimmy Conway in Goodfellas an 8.5 out of 10. And it's coming in at the number 11 spot on the list. And cracking our top 10 is Silver Linings Playbook. Now this is a performance that actually moved up for me in the rankings after rewatching it. The first time I watched the film I gave De Niro an 8. But when I came back to it, I realised I'd underestimated just how much was going on underneath the surface of this performance. De Niro plays Pat Sr., the father of Bradley Cooper's character. And on first viewing, it's easy to reduce him to the American football guy, you know? He's obsessed with the Philadelphia Eagles. He's constantly talking about American football. He's placing ridiculous bets, and he's convinced that somehow, someway, he can influence the outcome of games. But on rewatch, I realised that the American football is really just the vehicle through which the character expresses everything else. Because Pat is a man whose life is built around anxiety. He suffers from severe OCD, and De Niro does a brilliant job of showing how deeply it affects his everyday life without ever turning the character into a caricature. Every little thing feels important because, in Pat's mind, every little thing might affect the outcome of the game. And beneath all that anxiety is something much simpler. He loves his son. That's really the heart of the performance. Throughout the film, Pat is constantly trying to get through to Bradley Cooper's character. Sometimes he's patient, sometimes he's supportive, sometimes he completely loses his temper. But almost everything he does comes from a place of concern. There's a great scene where Pat breaks down talking about how he spent more time with one son than the other when they were growing up.
Maybe I didn't spend enough time with you. Growing up, I spent too much time with your brother. It might have made you feel worse about your behavior, but I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to handle it.
According to De Niro, the emotion in that scene wasn't heavily planned. He talked about simply trying to live truthfully in the moment rather than mapping out exactly where the scene needed to go emotionally. And it works. Because for maybe the first time in the film, we see all of Pat's defences disappear. The obsession with the Eagles, the superstition, the anger, the sarcasm, all of it drops away, and underneath is just a father who feels like he could have done better. What I also like about the character is that he wasn't always right. In fact, he's often completely wrong. He jumps to conclusions, he lets his impulses get the better of him, and he blames people for things they did not do. But when he realises he's wrong, he's generally willing to admit it. That makes him feel human. By the end of the film, Pat finally realises something that the audience have known for a while. The person his son should be with isn't Nikki, it's Tiffany. And one of his final moments is him reaching out to his son and desperately trying to get his son to see what's right in front of him. he talks about paying attention when life reaches out to you. And for all the flaws, it's a genuinely lovely moment. De Niro also spoke about how David O. Russell's directing style encouraged spontaneity and kept scenes feeling alive. And I think that really comes across here. The performance feels natural, messy, and believable in a way that suits the film perfectly. So I'm giving Robert De Niro as Pat Sr. in Silver Linings Playbook an 8.5 out of 10. And it comes in at number 10 on the list. Coming in at number 9 is The Deer Hunter. And now in terms of the film itself, this was one of the biggest surprises for me. The first time I watched it, I gave it like a 7 out of 10. I thought it was okay. And the second time I gave it a 9. Because once I knew where the story was going, I found myself appreciating the story, and especially De Niro's performance, way more. Here, De Niro plays Michael, a steel worker whose life has changed forever by the Vietnam War. And what struck me most watching it is that Michael might be the most dependable character on this entire list. From the opening scene, he feels like the leader of his little buddy group, if you want to call it that. He's the one organising the hunting trips, he's the one driving the car, and he's always naturally taking charge when decisions need to be made. He's also incredibly stubborn. Before the war, one of his friends forgets his boots on a hunting trip, and Michael refuses to lend him a spare pair.
Every time he comes up, he's got no knife, he's got no jacket, he's got no pants, he's got no boots.
It's a small moment, but it tells you a lot about him. Once Michael makes a decision, he's very difficult to move. But beneath all that stubbornness is a huge sense of responsibility. When they arrive in Vietnam, Michael becomes the person trying to hold everyone together. And the Russian roulette scene is still one of the most intense scenes I've ever watched, and De Niro is brilliant throughout it. What impressed me most is that Michael isn't fearless. He is terrified. You can see it all over his face. But he understands that panic won't help anybody survive, so he forces himself to stay calm and think clearly while everyone around him is falling apart. And that mindset follows him throughout the rest of the picture. Again and again and again, Michael puts other people before himself. He risks his life trying to save Stephen. He refuses to give up on Nick. And even after returning home, he can't seem to move on while the people he cared about are still suffering. One thing I also really like is how much of Michael's character is communicated without dialogue, particularly in those scenes with Linda, played by Meryl Streep. Long before he ever says anything out loud, De Niro tells us exactly how Michael feels about her through small glances, awkward pauses, and quiet reactions. Producer Michael Dealey said that De Niro did everything he could to make the picture work. He visited steelworks, spent time with local workers, and rehearsed extensively with the cast, and helped create the warmth and authenticity of the friendship group at the centre of the film. And I think that's exactly why the film works. Because when the tragedy strikes, the friendships feel completely real. It's not one of De Niro's flashiest performances, but it is one of his most selfless. So I'm giving Robert De Niro as Michael in The Deer Hunter a 9 out of 10, and it comes in at number 9 on the list. Coming in at number 8 is The Irishman. And with this being De Niro and Scorsese's 9th collaboration, 24 years after their 8th one in Casino, it was a big event. Now, in terms of this film, I know the de-aging technology was one of the biggest talking points when the film came out, but on rewatch I found myself thinking about it far less than I expected. Because once you sort of accept that it's there and settle into the story, what really carries the film is the performances, especially that of De Niro. De Niro plays Frank Sheeran, a World War II vet who gradually becomes one of the mafia's most trusted hitmen. And what struck me most on watching it is just how quiet Frank is. He isn't loud. He isn't flashy. He isn't trying to dominate every room he walks into. Instead, he spends most of the film simply following orders. Frank even compares life in the mafia to life in the army. You do what you're told. You don't ask questions. And that mindset shapes almost every decision he makes throughout the film. One thing I really like is that Frank often acts as a sort of peacemaker. Whenever tensions rise between Russell and Jimmy Hoffa, he's usually the one trying to hold everything together. He wants everyone to get along, which makes the second half of the film even more tragic, because eventually he's faced with a problem he can't solve. His loyalty to Russell comes into direct conflict with his friendship with Jimmy.
It's what it is.
What it is?
Yes, it's what they want.
For perhaps the first time in his life, following orders comes at a devastating personal cost. I also appreciate just how restrained De Niro is here. This isn't a performance built around some huge speeches or emotional outbursts. One member of the production described his performance as being very subtle, very deliberate, and very moving. And I think that's exactly right. Even when Frank says very little, you can usually tell exactly what he's thinking. I also found it very interesting how much attention was paid to playing Frank across different stages of his life. Scorsese, De Niro, and Joe Pesci all spoke about the fact that the de-aging technology could only do so much. If they still moved like older men, the illusion wouldn't work. So they focused heavily on posture, movement, and physicality, with Scorsese even reminding De Niro to stand straighter and move more lightly in certain scenes. The final act is where the performance really won me over though. As Frank grows older, the feared hitman slowly becomes a lonely old man. His friends die. His family drifts away. His daughter refuses to speak to him. And eventually, we watch him picking out his own coffin. It's quietly heartbreaking, and De Niro never overplays it. And by the time the credits roll, Frank isn't feared anymore. He's simply left alone with the consequences of the life he chose. So I'm giving Robert De Niro as Frank Sheeran in The Irishman a 9 out of 10. And it comes in at number 8 on the list. At number 7, we have Killers of the Flower Moon. Now, if you watch my DiCaprio ranking, which you need to watch, and if you haven't watched it, go watch it now. Anyways, if you have watched it, you'll know we've actually covered this film before. This time, however, we're going to be looking at Robert De Niro. And honestly, one of the things that impressed me most about this performance is that it came out 49 years after De Niro's first Oscar nomination. Because a lot of actors reach that stage in their career and they start coasting. De Niro reaches that stage of his career and still delivers one of the very best performances on this list. De Niro plays William Hale, a wealthy rancher and community leader who presents himself as a friend to the Osage people. He speaks their language, supports local causes, and seems to know everybody in town. The problem is that almost everything about that image is a lie. What makes Bill such a fascinating character is that he never looks like a villain. He wants people to trust him. He wants people to believe he's a good man. And for a long time, they do. Throughout the film, he quietly manipulates almost everyone around him, especially his nephew Ernest, played by the aforementioned DiCaprio. He talks about marriage like it's a business arrangement, money like it's more important than people, and views almost every relationship through the lens of what it can do for him. One thing I found particularly interesting is how De Niro described the character. He said Bill saw himself as a benefactor, a benevolent pillar of the community.
A pillar of the community?
I beg your pardon?
Whilst carrying out these horrific actions behind the scenes. And I think that's exactly why the performance works. Because Bill doesn't think he's the villain. De Niro even admitted himself that there were aspects of the character he didn't fully understand. And sometimes he just followed the behaviour wherever it led. But what comes through clearly is Bill's ability to justify his own actions. He genuinely seems to believe that he's a good man. So De Niro never plays him with obvious menace. He stays calm, polite and controlled, even as everything around him begins to fall apart. As the film goes on, his influence weakens, his plans become sloppier, and the mask starts to crack. But what makes the performance so effective is that De Niro never overplays any of it. Bill Hale isn't outwardly evil. He's quietly evil. The kind of person who can smile at you whilst destroying your life. So I'm giving Robert De Niro as William Hale in Killers of the Flower Moon a 9 out of 10. And it comes in at number 7 on the list. Coming in at number 6 is the King of Comedy. And this might be the most uncomfortable performance De Niro ever gave. Not because Rupert Pupkin is violent, not because he's dangerous, but because he's painfully believable. De Niro plays Rupert Pupkin, an aspiring comedian who's convinced that he's destined for stardom. The problem is that nobody else seems to agree. And what makes the performance so fascinating is that Rupert isn't completely delusional. He's actually talented. By the end of the film, when he finally gets his chance to perform, he's genuinely funny. The audience laughs, his timing is good, his delivery works. He clearly has a gift for comedy, which makes everything about him all the more tragic. Because Rupert believes his success should be inevitable. He believes that meeting Jerry Langford, played brilliantly by Jerry Lewis, should instantly change his life. He believes they're friends. He believes that eventually everybody who doubts him will be proved wrong. He believes that fame is waiting just around the corner if he can somehow force the right door open. And throughout the film we get these incredible fantasy sequences that show us exactly how Rupert thinks his life should be. He's Jerry's best friend. He's a television star. He's marrying the girl of his dreams on national television. He's standing in front of millions of people while everyone who ever doubted him apologises. These fantasies are absolutely ridiculous, but they're also strangely sad, because they reveal how badly Rupert wants validation. One thing I found really interesting while researching the film is that De Niro actually spent time with real autograph hunters when preparing for this role. He befriended them, visited their homes, and tried to understand what their lives were like. And I think that's why Rupert never feels like a caricature. In another actor's hands, this character could have easily become a joke. Instead, Rupert feels painfully recognisable, awkward, lonely, desperate.
It wasn't anybody else, it was me, and I didn't even ask you for money, and I can't even pay my rent! What are you talking about? I live in a hovel, and you live in a townhouse!
What I love most about the performance is that De Niro never judges him. Rupert can be childish, he can be naive, he can be incredibly irritating, but he's never malicious. Even when he kidnaps Jerry, he somehow treats it like a business arrangement. He genuinely believes this is the only logical solution to his problem. That is how warped his vision of reality has become. And also, I will say, unlike some performances we discussed earlier on, De Niro is actually really funny here.
George Cap, my high school principal.
You guessed it.
Well, how are you?
I'm
He used to
a
fail me all the time. What do you have him on the show for? He's an enemy.
His laugh is so stupid. The way, literally just like the way he walks, he's got a little bob to him, and it just cracks me up every time. The way he carries himself. The way he talks to people like they're already his mates, when they're just looking at him like, what the fuck are you doing, bro? Every scene feels like a car crash that you just can't stop watching. And then we get to the ending. De Niro actually said that Rupert's monologue was one of the reasons he wanted to make the picture in the first place. He loved the monologue so much, but after filming it once, he realised that he didn't do it justice, so he asked to delay shooting it and then to try it again a few weeks later. And the result is brilliant, because Rupert finally gets what he's wanted for the entire film. The spotlight, the audience, the attention, the validation. And somehow it feels both triumphant and deeply depressing at the same time. The final line of the monologue sums the character up perfectly.
Look, I figure it this way. Better to be king for a night than schmuck for a lifetime.
It's funny. It's sad. And it's probably exactly how Rupert sees the world. This is one of the biggest surprises of the entire project for me. I'd seen the film before, but on rewatch I appreciated just how layered this performance really is. Rupert Pupkin is funny, tragic, delusional, sympathetic and frustrating all at once. And De Niro somehow makes every side of him feel completely real. So I'm giving Robert De Niro as Rupert Pupkin in The King of Comedy a 9.5 out of 10. And it comes in at number 6 on the list. And entering our top 5, we have Cape Fear. And this is certainly De Niro's most undeniably evil character. De Niro plays Max Cady, a convicted rapist who has just been released from prison after serving 14 years behind bars. Upon his release, he begins hunting down the lawyer who originally represented him, Sam Bowden, because he believes Sam betrayed him during his trial. We later learn that Sam buried evidence which may have helped Max receive a shorter sentence. Now obviously that's unethical, but what makes Max so fascinating is how he views the situation. Because as far as Max is concerned, what Sam did to him is worse than the rape itself. Never mind the victim, never mind the crime. In Max's mind, Sam is the real villain of the story. And that's why Max doesn't just kill him. That would be too easy. Max wants revenge, real revenge. He wants Sam terrified. He wants Sam's wife terrified. He wants Sam's daughter terrified. He wants their entire family looking over their shoulders every second of the day. He wants them afraid to answer the phone, afraid to leave the house, afraid every time they see a stranger across the street, worried that it might just be him. He wants them to feel a fraction of the suffering that he believes Sam caused him. And what struck me most was just how calculating Max is. Everything this man does is part of a plan. The way he records Sam so we can use it against him in court. The way he deliberately stays within the boundaries of the law for most of the film. The way he manipulates Danielle by presenting himself as someone who understands her better than her parents do. Even something as simple as sitting outside the Bowden's house feels calculated. He's not doing it because he has nothing better to do. He's doing it because he wants them scared. He wants them constantly wondering where he is and what he's planning next. Max doesn't want them dead overnight. He wants them terrified for as long as possible. One little piece at a time. One of my favourite aspects of the performance is that Max is essentially an actor himself. He's constantly changing depending on who he's talking to. With Danielle, he presents himself as a caring older friend. With Laurie, he's charismatic and charming. And with Sam, he's constantly trying to provoke him into making a mistake. Max understands people. He understands what they want to hear, and he knows exactly how to use that against them. He's manipulative to his core. And every now and then, we get these brief moments where the mask slips. A glance, a smile, a look in his eye. Just enough for us to see the monster underneath. Physically, this might be the most intimidating De Niro has ever looked. Scorsese reportedly told him that Max needed to look like a, quote, lethal weapon, and De Niro completely committed to it. He trained obsessively for months, transforming himself into what genuinely looks like a man who has spent 14 years in prison turning himself into a weapon. And in typical De Niro fashion, he even spent thousands of dollars to have his own teeth grounded down for the role before spending even more money getting them fixed afterwards. Because of course he did, man. You know how this guy is by now. I also found Max's relationship with religion really interesting. Throughout the film, he's constantly quoting the Bible and talking about judgment, punishment, and righteousness. De Niro even studied passages from the King James Bible whilst preparing for the role, and helped design Max's tattoos around themes of vengeance and divine justice. The tattoos aren't just there to look cool, they're a manifesto. Because Max doesn't think he's evil, he thinks he's righteous. The writer of the film actually described Max as a, quote, avenging angel, and that's exactly how Max sees himself. Not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a man delivering justice. Because he's not just evil, he's calculating, he's manipulative, he's relentless, and completely convinced that he's right. Max Cady feels less like a man and more like a force of nature, an unstoppable nightmare that just keeps coming. So I'm giving Robert De Niro's Max Cady in Cape Fear another 9.5 out of 10. Coming in at number 4 is Taxi Driver. And even though this isn't my favourite De Niro performance, I do think that it is his most iconic. If you stop random people in the street and ask them to name a De Niro role, I genuinely think Travis Bickle would probably come up more than any other. I mean, just think about it, the mohawk, the voiceover, the yellow taxi, the...
You talking to me? You talking to me?
Scene. The character has become a major part of pop culture. And after rewatching this film, it's very easy to understand why. De Niro plays Travis Bickle, a Vietnam vet suffering from insomnia who takes a job driving a taxi through New York City at night. And what immediately struck me when watching it again was just how lonely Travis is. In fact, Travis describes himself perfectly during the film.
There's no escape from God's lonely man.
Because that's exactly what he is. Almost every scene in the film reinforces that idea. He's alone in his apartment. He's alone in his taxi. He's alone in diners. He's alone walking through the city. Even when he's surrounded by people, he somehow still feels isolated from them. Martin Scorsese actually said that he wanted the audience to experience the story largely from Travis's POV. And I think that's one of the reasons why the film works so well. Because we're trapped inside his head. We see the city the way he sees it. We hear his thoughts. We hear his diary entries. We hear his frustrations. We hear his anger. And gradually, we as an audience begin to understand how somebody like Travis could become Travis. One thing I find fascinating about the character is that he genuinely believes that he understands people. He thinks he can analyse them. He thinks he can figure them out and understand their motivations. And nowhere is that more obvious than with Betsy. The moment Travis first sees her, he decides that she's different.
She is alone. They cannot touch her.
He calls her an angel. He convinces himself that she's lonely like he is. That she's unhappy, that she's just like him. But the problem is that Travis doesn't actually know her. He's created a version of her in his own head. And when reality doesn't match the fantasy, he doesn't know how to cope with it.
Wait a second.
I have to go.
You gotta go. Wait a second. I want to talk to you.
Look,
Don't just
I
go.
have to go.
Wait a second.
That's one of the things I find most interesting about the performance. Travis's problem goes beyond loneliness. He's disconnected. He struggles to understand normal society behaviour. He struggles to connect with people, and because of that, he constantly misreads situations. The infamous porn cinema date is the perfect example. Because Travis doesn't take Betsy there to upset her. He genuinely thinks it's a normal date. That's what makes the scene so uncomfortable. He doesn't realise he's doing anything wrong. And then when she reacts badly, he can't understand why. From his perspective, he's done everything right. and that's a recurring theme throughout the film. Travis constantly sees himself as the reasonable person surrounded by unreasonable people. When relationships fail, it's someone else's fault. When people reject him, they're the problem. When he discussed society, society needs to change, never him. And De Niro plays all of that brilliantly. Because Travis never feels like a movie villain. He feels like somebody who took a series of wrong turns and never found his way back. One thing I noticed throughout the film is how much of the performance is internal. There are scenes when Travis barely says anything. Instead, De Niro communicates everything through looks, through posture, through tiny reactions, through the way his eyes constantly scan the world around him. It's a masterclass in showing a mind slowly turning against itself. And it's made even more impressive when you consider how much preparation De Niro put into this role. In typical De Niro fashion, he actually worked as a taxi driver in New York before filming, trying to understand the people, the atmosphere, and the experience of driving through the city at night. That attention to detail is all over the place in this performance. Travis feels authentic. He feels like somebody who existed before the film started and will continue existing after it ends. What also fascinates me is how the city itself almost becomes a character. Travis sees New York as a place full of filth, full of corruption, full of what he repeatedly calls scum. And he talks about the city needing to be cleaned up, about rain coming and washing everything away. It's as if he sees himself as the only person capable of recognising what's wrong in the world. The problem is that Travis becomes so obsessed with fixing society that he completely loses sight of reality. And this is where the performance changes. As the film progresses, Travis becomes increasingly dangerous. The guns, the training, the workouts, the mohawk, the mirror scene. These moments have become iconic because we're watching somebody gradually radicalise himself. Nobody tells Travis to do what he eventually does. Nobody manipulates him into it. He arrives to that conclusion on his own. It's like with Rupert Pupkin. He decides that the only course of action is to kill Sport and try and kill Charles Palantine. And as I've just mentioned, the scene that perfectly captures that transformation is the famous mirror scene. The line, "Are you talking to me?" was famously improvised by De Niro, but what makes the scene so memorable isn't really the quote, it's what the quote represents. Travis is rehearsing, practicing, preparing for a confrontation that doesn't even exist yet. He's playing both sides of a conversation. He's creating enemies, creating scenarios, creating a version of himself that feels powerful. By this point, he's completely detached from normal life, and yet somehow De Niro still makes him feel compelling to watch. The final act is where everything comes together, because by now, Travis has convinced himself that his purpose is to save Iris. And what's interesting is that this might be the first genuinely selfless thing he does in the entire film. He doesn't want anything from her. He isn't trying to impress her. He isn't trying to sleep with her. He genuinely believes that he's helping her. He sees her as somebody who still has a chance in this cruel, evil world that he finds himself in. And that's exactly what makes the ending so interesting. Because Travis gets exactly what he's always wanted. Recognition, purpose, validation. The lonely man finally becomes somebody that people notice. Whether the ending is real or not is a debate that people have been having for decades. And personally, I don't really think it matters. Because the point isn't whether Travis changed the world. The point is that after everything that happened, he's still Travis Bickle. He's still lonely. He's still disconnected. He's still driving his taxi. The cycle never truly ends. And that's why the performance stays with you. Travis feels like a product of his environment. A man created by isolation, alienation, and a desperate search for meaning. He's disturbing. He's fascinating. He's tragic. And most importantly, he's believable. Even 50 years later, it's impossible to take your eyes off of him. So while I don't think that this is Robert De Niro's greatest performance, I do think that it's probably his most iconic. So with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver a 9.5 out of 10, and it's coming in at number 4 on the list. In third place, we have Awakenings, and this is one of the most emotional performances I have ever seen. Not just from De Niro, from any actor. Awakenings tells the true story of a group of catatonic patients who are temporarily brought back to consciousness through an experimental treatment. De Niro plays Leonard Lowe, a man who has spent decades trapped inside his own body before suddenly being given a second chance at life. And what struck me most when rewatching this is that Leonard might be the most tragic character I've ever seen put to screen. Because unlike so many tragic characters, Leonard hasn't done anything wrong. Life has simply been unbelievably cruel to him. When we meet him, he's essentially frozen, unmoving, unresponsive. His eyes seem vacant. His body barely reacts to the world around him. He's physically present, but he feels completely disconnected from everything happening around him. And yet De Niro somehow makes it clear that there is still somebody inside. One of the most impressive aspects of the performance is how much he communicates whilst barely speaking at all. There are long stretches of the film where Leonard has almost no dialogue. Everything comes through physicality, through posture, through tiny movements, through stillness. It's the definition of show, don't tell acting. And the amount of preparation that went into creating Leonard is astonishing. When researching the role, De Niro worked closely with patients suffering from conditions similar to Leonard's, videotaping their movements and studying them repeatedly so he could recreate them as accurately as possible. Nothing about the performance feels exaggerated. Nothing feels like acting. It feels absurd. It feels real. It feels human. And then comes the awakening itself. And honestly, this is where the performance completely won me over. Because Leonard doesn't suddenly wake up and behave like a normal adult. Mentally, still carrying the mindset of someone who's lost decades of his life. So everything feels new. Everything feels exciting. Everything feels miraculous. Watching Leonard rediscover the world is genuinely beautiful. The first time he writes his name again. The first time he hugs his mother again. The first time he walks outside again. The first time he feels the breeze from a fan. The first time he stands in the sunlight again after 30 years. These are things that most people wouldn't think twice about. To Leonard, they're extraordinary. And that's one of my favourite things about the character. He appreciates life more than anybody else in the film. Because unlike everyone around him, he knows exactly what it feels like to lose it. There's a scene where he talks about newspapers always being full of negativity and how people have forgotten how incredible it is to simply be alive. And the thing is, he's right. Leonard understands something that the rest of us often forget. Being alive is a gift. Having the ability to walk, to talk, to go outside, to spend time with the people you love, to choose what to do with your day. Those things matter, and Leonard never takes any of them for granted. That's why one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the film comes when he asks the hospital board for permission to go for a walk by himself. Such a simple request, such a normal request. And yet for Leonard it means everything. When they ask him what he would actually do on the walk, his answer is essentially, "What do you think I'd do?"
I'd go for a walk. I'd look at things. I'd talk to people. I would decide if I want to go in this direction or that direction or straight ahead.
The tragedy is that the people judging him don't understand why that matters. Only Leonard does. Because he spent 30 years unable to do any of it. And unfortunately for him, life isn't finished being cruel. Because eventually, the treatment begins to fail. The tics begin. The twitching begins. The lack of control over his own body begins. And suddenly we watch Leonard realise that the life he had fought so hard to regain is slipping away from him once again. This is where the performance becomes almost unbearable to watch. Not because it's bad, because it's too good. Watching Leonard desperately trying to keep his hands steady. Watching him struggle to read. Watching him struggle to speak. Watching him lose control of his own body. It's heartbreaking. Because he knows exactly what's happening. And he can't stop it. There are moments in the film where he begs Dr. Sayer to put a stop to this and not give up on him.
Can you stop this? I'm not sure, but I'm trying.
Don't give up on me.
I won't.
He fought for 30 years to come back to life. And now he's being forced backwards.
I have a sickness. Sickness took me out of the world, and I fought to come back. I fought for 30 years. 30 years.
And he simply cannot accept it. And one scene in particular absolutely destroys me. Leonard begins suffering a severe episode of tics, and he tells Dr. Sayer to get the camera and record. He wants him to learn from what's happening. He keeps repeating that word, learn. Learn from me. Even in his worst moment, Leonard wants his suffering to mean something. He wants future patients to be helped. He wants somebody else to benefit from what he's going through. It's selfless, and as I said, it's heartbreaking. And it's one of the most emotional scenes De Niro has ever performed. By the end of the film, Leonard is back where he started. The freedom is gone. The independence is gone. The future he briefly imagined for himself is gone. And all that's left is the memory of what could have been. What makes this performance so special isn't that it's flashy. It isn't. It isn't built around huge speeches or explosive moments. It's built around humanity, around vulnerability, around loss, around hope, and ultimately around the simple desire to live an ordinary life. There are performances on this list that are more intimidating. There are performances on this list that are more iconic, but there are very few that affect me emotionally the way Leonard Lowe does. Every time I watch this film, I leave feeling grateful for things that I normally take for granted in day-to-day life. And honestly, that's basically the highest compliment I can give to any performance. So with all that said, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Leonard Lowe in Awakenings our first 10 out of 10 of the video. And it comes in at number 3 on the list. And I know what you're thinking, bloody hell, Rafe. Already a 10 out of 10. Mate, this guy, absolute levels. So let's get into number 2, shall we? In at number 2, and narrowly missing out on the top spot, we have The Godfather Part 2. Now this was De Niro's first Oscar-winning performance, taking home Best Supporting Actor at the 1975 Academy Awards. Although funnily enough, De Niro actually wasn't present at the ceremony to collect his award because he was away filming a film called 1900 in Europe at the time. And honestly, what makes this performance so impressive is the challenge that came with it. A couple of years earlier, Marlon Brando had just delivered one of the most iconic acting performances ever put to screen as Vito Corleone in The Godfather. And then a young De Niro had the impossible task of playing the exact same character decades younger. Now, a lesser actor might have done an impression. De Niro didn't. Instead, he reportedly sat watching Brando scenes from the original film over and over again, studying every little detail and every little mannerism. He travelled around Sicily, recording local dialects, worked extensively on the language, and built a version of Vito that genuinely feels like the same man, just 30 years younger. And that's the thing that strikes me every time I watch this performance. I don't see Robert De Niro trying to be Marlon Brando. I just see Vito Corleone. A younger Vito Corleone. The same pride, the same calmness, the same confidence. The same belief that he deserves respect, even before he has any power whatsoever. One of my favourite aspects of the character is that Vito already carries himself like a don long before anybody actually starts calling him one. At the start of the film, he's just a grocery store worker trying to provide for his wife and children. But the way he walks, the way he talks, the way he holds himself, you'd think he was already running New York. There's an aura to him that is impossible to ignore. When Don Fanucci starts throwing his weight around, Vito isn't intimidated. When his friends panic, Vito stays calm. When people insult him, Vito stays calm. When people underestimate him, Vito stays calm. Because he genuinely seems to believe that his success is inevitable. The world simply hasn't realised it yet. And that confidence becomes one of the defining traits of the entire performance. What I also love is just how calculating he is. Everything Vito does feels thought through. Whether it's hiding the guns for his neighbour, dealing with Fanucci, helping people in the neighbourhood, or eventually building his reputation, every act feels deliberate. He isn't impulsive, he isn't reckless. He watches, he listens, and he waits. And then after all that, he acts. And the assassination of Fanucci is probably the perfect example of that. He spends the entire sequence stalking him across the rooftops like a predator following prey. Every step has already been planned, the route, the gun, the escape, everything. And yet despite how calm and controlled he usually is, De Niro also gives us little flashes of humanity beneath the surface. Moments where Vito worries about his sick child. Moments where he looks lovingly at his wife. Moments where he's playing with his children. Because for all of the violence that exists within this character, Vito is fundamentally a family man. Family comes before everything for him. And that's what makes him such an interesting contrast to someone like Max Cady or Travis Bickle. Vito isn't driven by chaos. He's driven by loyalty, by respect, by family, by obligation. If you help him, he'll never forget it. If you betray him, he'll never forget that either. Which brings us to one of the most important parts of the character, revenge. Decades after Don Ciccio ordered the murders of Vito's mother, father and brother, Vito returns to Sicily to settle the score. By this point, the man is barely clinging to life. Most people would have moved on. Vito Corleone isn't most people. If you wrong him, he remembers. Always. And De Niro plays that final confrontation brilliantly. There's no rage, no screaming, no theatrics, just certainty. Vito has waited his entire life for this moment, and now it's finally here. The thing that amazes me most is just how much De Niro accomplishes with such limited screen time. Compared to most of the performances on this list, he actually isn't on screen for very long. But every scene matters. Every scene develops the character. Every scene leaves an impression. And by the time the credits roll, it genuinely feels as though we've watched the birth of the man we met in the first film. and that is an incredibly difficult thing to pull off. To take one of cinema's most iconic characters and convince an audience that you're watching the exact same person decades earlier. But De Niro does it effortlessly. For the calmness, for the confidence, for the presence, for the aura, and for creating one of the greatest portrayals of a young version of an existing character ever put to screen, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Vito Corleone in The Godfather Part 2 a 10 out of 10. Now before we get to number 1, I'm going to cheat slightly, because I couldn't make a De Niro video without talking about Heat.
I've got Heat on DVD at home. We're watching this when for less money we could be watching Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. I'm going to pretend I am watching Heat. Okay, let's pretend we're just watching Heat.
Smile on me. And with coral circling their pretty arms in a round ivory fount.
I've kind of been teasing it this whole video with the poster, but I just can't hold it any longer. I need to talk about it. Now, technically, this film does not qualify for the ranking. De Niro didn't receive any nominations from the award bodies that count towards the video, so by my own rules it can't be included. But for me, this is one of the greatest performances of De Niro's entire career. Directed by Michael Mann and released in 1995, Heat follows a crew of career criminals led by De Niro's character Neil McCauley as they're pursued by Al Pacino's LAPD detective Vincent Hanna. And for me, this is subtle acting at its absolute highest level. Everything is in the eyes. The little looks, the tiny, minuscule gestures. The moments where he barely seems to be doing anything at all. And yet somehow you still understand exactly what the character is thinking in every scene. One thing that I've observed when watching these films for the rankings with friends and family is that they say they can't really rate an acting performance out of 10. I'll be like, oh, well, I gave De Niro an 8 or I gave DiCaprio a 7. What's your opinion? And they say, oh, they can't really tell what's good acting from bad acting. Not because they don't enjoy the film, but they just say they don't really know how to judge acting. They just see the character. And if you've ever felt like that, I'd encourage you to watch 2 versions of the famous diner scene from Heat. One is, of course, the original version with De Niro and Pacino, and the other is a version that a friend and I performed at drama school a few months ago. I've linked both in the description. And I personally think I'm an okay actor. And this is no criticism of my friend either. But when you put my version of Neil next to De Niro's version, you realise that there are absolute levels to this game. You realise just how difficult it is to give so little away on the surface whilst communicating so much underneath. Neil is also a deeply tragic character. He spent his life convincing himself that attachments are a weakness, only to finally find someone worth caring about and losing everything because he can't let go of revenge. If he had qualified for this ranking, it would have been a serious contender for the very top spot. But with that said, let's finally get to our number 1 spot. And at number 1, we have Raging Bull. And honestly, I don't think there was ever much doubt that it was going to finish here. This is Robert De Niro's Academy Award-winning performance for Best Actor in a Leading Role as Jake LaMotta. And after rewatching it, I'm more convinced than ever that it's one of the greatest acting performances ever put on film. One thing that surprised me whilst researching this film is that Raging Bull almost didn't happen at all. It was actually De Niro who first discovered Jake LaMotta's autobiography and became fascinated by the story. He brought the book to Martin Scorsese and spent years persuading him that they should make the picture together. And looking back now, it's difficult to imagine anybody else playing this part, because Jake LaMotta is one of the most fascinating characters on this entire list. On the surface, he's a boxer, but boxing isn't really what this film is about. It's about anger, it's about pride, it's about insecurity, and ultimately, it's about self-destruction. And what struck me most on rewatch is that Jake's greatest opponent isn't Sugar Ray Robinson. It isn't the mafia. It isn't the boxing establishment. It's himself. From the very beginning of the film, Jake is fighting battles that nobody else can see. He tells Joey that he hates having small hands because it means he'll never get to fight heavyweight greats like Joe Louis. He genuinely believes that he's good enough to beat him. He just thinks that life has cheated him. And that insecurity never ever leaves him. In fact, with time it only grows. One thing I found really interesting is that Jake constantly mistakes paranoia for intuition. He becomes convinced that his wife Vicky is cheating on him. He becomes convinced that his brother Joey has betrayed him. he becomes convinced that everyone around him is lying to him. The tragedy is that almost all of it exists only inside his own mind. Because Vicky never actually cheated on him, and yet Jake destroys his marriage anyway. He destroys his relationship with his brother anyway. He destroys his family. Not because reality betrayed him, but because his own mind did. And that's what makes the character so heartbreaking. Jake isn't simply an angry man. He's an incredibly insecure one. And the anger is just how that insecurity escapes. One minute he's calm, the next he's throwing tables, screaming in the street, beating his wife, attacking his brother, or taking his frustrations out on whoever happens to be standing right in front of him. And the title couldn't be more appropriate. He really is a raging bull. What also fascinated me is how pride controls almost every decision Jake makes. Early on, he refuses help from the mafia because he wants to reach the top on his own terms. And eventually, he's forced to throw a fight just to earn a title shot. And afterwards, he sits in the dressing room openly weeping. Not because he lost, but because he knows he's sold a part of his soul. And for a man whose entire identity is built around pride, that is devastating. Eventually, Jake does become the middleweight champion of the world. And I think that's one of the smartest parts of the entire film. Because most sports films end there. Raging Bull doesn't. Because winning the title changes absolutely nothing. Jake finally achieves the dream he spent his entire life chasing. And almost immediately, he starts gaining weight. He loses his direction. His paranoia gets worse. His marriage falls apart. His family falls apart. His career falls apart. The championship wasn't the answer. It was just another stop on the road to destroying himself. One thing I also noticed throughout the film is how De Niro constantly changes Jake depending on where he is in his life. Inside the ring, Jake almost looks relaxed. He barely covers his face during fights. He walks forward without fear. Sometimes he even looks bored. It's as though he genuinely believes nobody can hurt him. But outside the ring, he's terrified. Terrified of losing Vicky. Terrified of betrayal. Terrified of disrespect. And terrified of not being enough. The strongest man in the room becomes the weakest the moment he leaves the ropes. And I think De Niro captures that contradiction brilliantly. One of my favourite moments comes during the Robinson fight near the end of Jake's career. He's taking unimaginable punishment. He's barely fighting back. But after the bell rings and the fight's over, he simply goes to Sugar Ray and says,
Never went down, Ray. You never got me down, Ray.
Even after losing everything, his pride survives. It's all he has left. And then we get to the final act, the older Jake. And this is genuinely the greatest physical transformation I've ever seen an actor undergo. Rather than wearing prosthetics to play the older version of Jake, De Niro insisted on gaining the weight himself. He gained about 60 pounds because he wanted to understand what it actually felt like to live inside Jake's older body. He even had doctors monitoring the weight gain and his cholesterol throughout that process. That's an extraordinary level of commitment. But what makes it remarkable is that the weight isn't the performance. It's what De Niro does with it. The posture changes, the movement changes, the confidence changes, the voice changes, the energy changes. He genuinely feels and looks like a completely different person. The proud young champion has become a tired man trying to convince himself that he's still relevant, that he's still somebody. And nowhere is that clearer than the heartbreaking prison cell scene towards the end. And for me, this is the greatest acting moment of De Niro's career. Jake has lost everything. His wife, his children, his brother, his career, his reputation, his freedom. He starts headbutting the wall, punching it, calling himself stupid, crying out, asking, Why? And it's the only way he knows how to deal with this pain, by hitting something. Except this time, the only thing left to hit is himself. It's absolutely devastating. And what makes it even sadder is that despite everything he's done, you still feel sorry for him. Not because he's innocent, far from it, but because De Niro never lets us forget that underneath all the violence, all the rage and all the arrogance, there's still just a human being. De Niro himself actually described Jake as a deeply empathetic character. And I think that's exactly why the performance works. Because De Niro never judges him, he simply tries to understand him. The preparation behind the role is almost unbelievable. De Niro trained for months with Jake LaMotta himself, working with professional trainers every day, and learned to box to the point where the fight scenes feel completely authentic. Every punch, every movement, every reaction, nothing feels performed. It feels lived. And by the time the film reaches the final scene, Jake is standing in front of a mirror, quoting on the waterfront.
It wasn't him, Charlie, it was you. You remember that night at the garden? You came down my dressing room and you said, "Kid, this ain't your night. We're going for the price on Wilson."
It's one of the most heartbreaking endings I've ever seen. Because Jake was a contender. He became champion. He achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of, unlike Terry Malloy. And somehow, he still lost. Not to another boxer, to himself. And that's why I think this performance is so extraordinary. It's physically astonishing. It's emotionally devastating. It's technically flawless. And somehow it still feels completely human. I've now watched this performance 3 times, and every single time I've come away more impressed than the last. For the transformation, for the preparation, for the humanity, for creating one of the most tragic characters ever put on screen, I'm giving Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta a 10 out of 10, and it's taking the #1 spot on our list. So yeah, there you have it. That is my ranking of every notable Robert De Niro performance. And one thing that really surprised me while making this video is just how often my opinions lined up with the Academy's. If you remember from my DiCaprio video, I had a lot of debates about stuff like What's Eating Gilbert Grape, or especially Blood Diamond being Oscar nominated. Whereas here, our opinions sort of lined up. You know, apart from King of Comedy, I mean, my top 2 were his 2 Oscar wins. So I kind of feel like we're on the same page, me and the Academy, for once. And a very interesting statistic is, unlike Leo's 8.6 average Oscar nominations rating, De Niro's average Oscar nominations rating was 9.44. That's almost 9.5 out of 10 average rating for his Oscar nominated performances. So let's just say I think the Academy got it right in this case. And another thing that stood out to me whilst I did this sort of watch through of De Niro's career, watching a lot of his notable films from Greetings in 1968 up to Killers of the Flower Moon in 2023, with obviously the 17 performances as well as other sort of notable films mixed in. And what I noticed is that the quality of acting was consistent throughout those 55 years. And I kind of realised it was like, some performances were Oscar nominated, some were Golden Globes nominated, some had no nominations. Some films became classics, some didn't. But the quality of the acting itself remained extremely high throughout every project I saw. Whether it was Godfather Part 2 in the 70s, Heat in the 90s, Meet the Parents in the 2000s, The Irishman in 2019, or Killers from 3 years ago, it never felt like I was watching a lesser version of Robert De Niro. And the statistics back that up as well. His overall average rating across the 17 performances we looked at was 8.71, which is actually quite a bit higher than DiCaprio's 8.47 from his video. And when you look at things broken down by decade, you can also see remarkable consistency. The 70s were excellent, the 80s were excellent, the 90s were excellent. Even the decades where I wasn't quite as high on the films themselves still contained great De Niro performances. Something else I found interesting is that, unlike with the DiCaprio ranking, where every performance seemed to find its own sort of place in the list, you know, there were sort of quite a few 7.5s, and then we had a couple 8s and 8.5s. Here we kind of went rubbish, decent, amazing, you know, a group of 9s. I think 3 9.5s and then 3 10s. And I think the reason why is because when you're dealing with somebody at this level, at De Niro's level, it becomes very difficult to separate the best from the best. Like, the best of the best from, you know, amazing from brilliant, extraordinary from really good. And having now completed this project, having, as I mentioned, watched 28 De Niro films spanning 55 years, I can honestly say that I feel like I have a much better understanding of the career of my favourite actor. But you know what? It's really interesting because I almost feel less connected to De Niro than I did to DiCaprio. Like, when I was making the DiCaprio video, obviously I was watching all of his interviews and press releases and stuff from from the 90s to last year for One Battle After Another. Whereas here, it was interesting because De Niro is so, not reclusive, but averse to interviews, let's say. I feel like I know less about him and feel less close to him than I did with DiCaprio, which doesn't make sense because obviously I don't even know the guy and he's like an old dude. But either way, man, it did not affect my respect for him because my respect for this guy is top. Like, there's people in this world probably like him and Ronaldo, man. Anyways, enough waffling. So in terms of my next video, oh, actually, De Niro can tell you all about it. Let's see what he has to say.
I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. Instead of a bum, which is what I am.
But that's the future video. This is the current video. This video took about a month to put together, so not as long as the DiCaprio video, but I think from making the Leo video, I found it easier to make this one, if that makes sense. So yeah, there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like. Leave a comment saying you watched if I know you. Like I said, I hope you enjoyed. And if you haven't seen some of these films, please check them out, you know. Raging Bull, just an insane performance. Awakenings, I never hear people talking about Awakenings when they talk about De Niro. And it's so fucking good. Like, the film and the performance are genuinely exquisite. And Heat. If you haven't watched Heat, I don't care who you are, where you live, what you like, this right here, you need to put it on right now. It's probably on Prime, it's probably on Netflix, you know, you can find it, man. Just watch it. Just treat yourself to it. But anyways, more than anything else, I'm glad that after spending the last month immersed in his work, I feel closer to understand the career of my very favourite actor. So thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all in a bit. Cheers.